changes and looking at the game and saying, hey, is this what our fans want? That really rarely happened until relatively recently. And now, as you know, it seems like every year there's something new. Either it's happening or it's being experimented with. And
Right.
I don't remember. I apologize if you read my book, which came out quite a long time ago now, 7 years. We probably did a podcast about it.
Powerball?
That's right. Yeah, Powerball.
Yeah. Bought it too.
Oh, that's sweet of you. Came out in the fall of 2018, so 6.5 years ago. What I argued in that book was that baseball needed to be more responsive to what the fans want and to do more experimenting, and that has happened. Now, it is inevitable that if you try new things, you are going to find some percentage of your customers who don't like what you do. I don't care who the customer is, especially if they're passionate or you know if they really pay attention. You try 10 things, your chances of getting all 10 right with that one customer is basically zero, right?
Right.
Unless they are just unless they have a fetish for change, which I don't. And there are some things that baseball has done or has talked about doing in the last few years that I would rather they didn't do. But overall, the openness, I think, is a positive development for most fans and for the future health of the game.
Yeah, there's some things that I wish they wouldn't change. I'm not a big fan of automated balls and strikes. You know, we're getting further and further away from humans in the game.
Right.
But I also understand like the desire to like, hey, how do we clean this up? How do we rotate umpires who aren't meeting the standard, that kind of thing. But then I saw it put into action and it wasn't that bad because it was almost instantaneous.
Right.
And so that's my beef.
Right. What they're
very limited. Yeah.
I believe you're limited to 2 misses per team per game. So you have to be judicious. And I don't know if you want to talk about this specific thing right now, but one of the ways that you can increase your experimentation success is by keeping good notes. Or what is the data? And they've extensively studied what happens in AAA baseball, which is the style is basic. It's almost exactly the same as the majors, right?
Right.
And what they found is that teams use it judiciously. They use it typically in the 9th inning when it's critical. They use it on full counts when it changes the plate appearance, right? And the trick is limiting it, obviously. And what would happen if you could appeal every pitch, or if you couldn't appeal every pitch, it would take too long, right? We might get to a place someday where there's no appeals because there's no umpire judgment involved. It's just the machine. But we're not there yet. And from what I understand, nobody inside baseball wants to be there yet. That doesn't mean we won't be there in 5 years or 10. Probably will as the technology improves. That's probably inevitable. But right now, what is the best thing that's available? And it probably is a limited ABS system, which they used in spring training this year. And I think I'll be very surprised if we don't see it during the regular season next year.
Yeah, and like I said, it was pretty seamless. Some of the things that I wonder about, and MLB's bad at communicating these things, but the strike zone is 3-dimensional, but it doesn't appear to be with this automated balls and strikes thing. So if you nip the back corner of the strike zone, you should be able to see that. Maybe it can, but I don't believe that it can. Do you know the answer to that? Is it 2-dimensional, 3-dimensional, the strike zone?
Well, the rulebook strike zone is absolutely 3-dimensional. The effective strike zone is not. That pitch you're talking about, which we all probably, shouldn't say we all, you and I and probably most of our like-minded souls think that if you throw a pitch and it crosses the plate in that whatever you call a 3-dimensional rectangle, it should be a strike. The pitcher hey, I'm the pitcher. I just did my job. You told me to throw it over that thing, and I just threw it over that thing. Well, yes. But the reality is that umpires miss those pitches all the time because it's almost impossible for them to see it, right?
Yeah.
Remember the black, people are painting the black, right?
Oh
there's
my
a
gosh.
black outline around the plate. Well, good luck seeing that as an umpire when the splinker is coming in at 92 miles an hour, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
the umpires are incredibly talented. They really are. I mean, you
Yeah.
literally have some games where the umpire, according to the system that has been used in the past, missed 0 pitches in the game. That's happened, or 1
Yeah.
or 2, and then sometimes it's 12 or 15. Part of that is luck, right? The more close pitches you have, the more likely you are to miss some of them, and you're going to have
Yeah.
more close pitches in some games than others. Part of it is obviously skill because there are some umpires who routinely rate up here in the mid 90s and some are in the low 90s.
Yeah.
But the effective strike zone is not really 3-dimensional. It really is, for the most part, 2-dimensional because nobody, the pitchers, the catchers, the umpires, have the ability to see that 3-dimensional space in that
Reliably. Okay.
split second. So I think what we're seeing now is essentially a machine that's calling a 2-dimensional strike zone. There's been lots of studies done about this, and lots of scientists have weighed in. I don't understand the technicalities, but it seems to be essentially a two-dimensional strike zone. That doesn't mean the future equipment can't measure it in 3D. But what you're going to see, what we're already seeing, is they're not going to define the strike zone the way it is in the rule book. They're going to define the strike zone to create the game they want to create, which there's an argument to be made for that. But it is difficult to sort of square with. But yeah, but you gave me this book. It's called the rule book, and it has this diagram. Why are you not using that? Well, because we don't want to.
Right. Yeah. You can't know what it is. That's IP for the company that we've contracted with.
Right. No, they've been pretty above board when it comes to the science of it and what they're going to wind up doing. I think one of the things that baseball has done with this in particular is they know there's going to be a lot of resistance to this kind of change. And so they're trying to manage that resistance by being pretty transparent about the process. Not completely, especially when they were experimenting. But I think as it gets rolled out in the majors, enough people who have power, i.e. the union, the players' union, for example, the baseball won't have a choice. They'll have to be transparent. Otherwise, there'll be all these conspiracy theories. Oh, you're weighting it to help this team, or tall hitters, or short, whatever. So they're going to have to be pretty transparent with it, or it just won't be accepted.
Yeah. Yeah, boy. And you'll see it every year. And I'm guilty of thinking this too, the balls, because Major League Baseball controls the balls. You don't know what balls put in play. Right. And when the balls start flying out after a given point in the year, is it weather? Is it ratings? You just don't know. And we know that Major League Baseball has had an inconsistent account on what the balls do and don't do. And that also is a thing where it's one of the few sports where the equipment can dramatically change, how the outcomes are in the game.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the only thing I could think of that's similar, it probably isn't true anymore, but I know for decades there was a wide range of rink sizes in the NHL. And of course, in baseball, there's still a wide variety of ballpark dimensions. But you're right. I mean, basically, baseball is the only one left where the equipment's different. People have different bats, and the balls you're never sure about. And of course, the dimensions are all different. So yes, baseball probably is way more influenced by non-player factors than any other sport.
Yeah. And I wonder about, because we've had so much, baseball has cheating in its culture. It's fun to cheat, if you get away with something, but surveillance is so ubiquitous now, like in a ballpark, it is really hard to convince me that there isn't constant attempts to compromise what the other team is doing. I mean, why wouldn't you read lips and just have a camera trained there, and there's so many things you can do. You can have not a human do it and build a system. Do you think that there's a potential problem there with technology as we go forward?
It's an interesting question. Certainly
teams... Because PitchCom kind of solves it, but not really. If you're talking in the book, in the dugout.
Teams will always look for edges. We know that. Teams and players will always cheat. We know that. Because that's been the case in literally every single sport that's ever existed, as far as I know. I mean, when I played Ultimate Frisbee in college, we didn't have officials. And for the most part, everybody was really cool. But that was Ultimate Frisbee, right? Yeah. There was no money involved. Golf, there's this code of ethics, but I think people pretty much stick to it for the most part in professional golf because there are cameras trained on every single thing they do. We know people cheat all the time when they're playing at their local club. I don't know what the percentage is, but I know people do it.
Yeah.
And that's not for any money. So I think when you get to this level, everybody's going to look for an edge.
Yeah.
I also think that just as I think has been the case with PEDs in the major leagues, I think that the penalties that have been established for electronic cheating in the major leagues are so severe that it's going to discourage or dissuade almost everyone from actually doing it.
Right.
Because the punishment that the Astros received, people say, oh, I don't think, well, they had a huge fine and not so much draft picks. That's really tough. Now, did they thrive afterward anyway? Yes, they did. But one would assume that the penalty the next time would be even more severe. More draft picks, more millions of dollars. So, and also, you would have to ask the players themselves, but I would be willing to bet that if you ask those guys in 10, 20 years who are on that team, they would say the grief that we have received when we play baseball over the last, for the rest of our careers was not worth it. And I think that everyone else has sort of looked at those guys and, wow, I don't want to be him. I don't want to be Alex Bregman getting booed every single place I play for the next 8, 10, 12 years. So certainly it wasn't the last of cheating that we'll ever see. I think that baseball handled it well enough that it's not going to happen often or soon. That's just a theory.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and obviously baseball has eras. We're about to probably have an expansion era at some point again, and that will change everything and how it all works. The era we're in now, what would you call it? Like, what defines this era?
Ooh, that's a good question. Wow, that would be a great blog post if I were still blogging. I do write on Substack sometimes. That's not very often, not as often as I should. I do write on Substack occasionally. That would be a great article, and it's quite possible that someone's already written it. Let's brainstorm a little bit because I don't have any great ideas yet. What do you think?
I mean, if I'm going to be cynical, I'm going to call it the Tommy John era. Because I don't know, it's so hard to pick one thing. Like when we call it the PED era, I think that's completely unfair because there was a confluence of all these different influences.
Wait, are you saying it's fair to call it that now or the previous era?
No, okay, yes. I'm saying the previous era that we call the steroid era. I think that's an unfair characterization because a lot of things came to fruition during that time.
It might be unfair, but I think we're stuck with it, right?
Right. Yeah, fair enough. So I guess my point is when we look at the things that are going on, it would be unfair to call it the Tommy John era, but maybe it's the analytics era because people hate that word and they're so passionate about it. And so, maybe that's what it is. I don't know. Sometimes they're good words. Sometimes they're bad words. So
right. Well, I think you have to, there's a sort of I'm not smart enough to know the right word for this. Mm-hmm. There is a philosophical, that's not the right word, but it is a word. There is a philosophical question that you can ask when you have these conversations, which is, what are we going to call it or what should we call it? I had somebody get on me one time because I called the era of Yankees history from 1965 to 1972-ish. I called it the Horace Clarke era. Now, for people who are really into their history, they know that Horace Clarke was a pretty good player, second baseman with the Yankees in the late 60s, but the Yankees were terrible for a lot of those years, especially relative to the expectations. And when I wrote that at one point, a long time ago, I went through and I gave a name to every era in Yankees history. And I said Horace Clarke era. And a couple people, that's not fair to Horace Clarke. Well, I didn't make it up. That's what people call it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's like these things take on lives of their own, and we can tilt at that windmill all we want and say, no, let's call it the whatever, the CBS era, because CBS owns the team and they stunk. But
Right.
nobody calls it the CBS era. You can make
Yeah.
up your own list and say what they should have called it, but no, what people have come to call it is the Horace Clarke era. Even if it's unfair to Clarke, which it is, because he was one of their best players. That's an issue. When Horace Clarke is your best player, you have a problem. Actually, it's probably Mel Stottlemyre. But anyway, I think we're stuck with steroid era, even though I agree with you that it's not fair.
Right.
I think we have to ultimately try to turn to the culture around us and say, well, what do people, not what I would call it, but what are people going to call it based on the way these things work? And I think it might be the strikeout era, the power pitching era. That's not very catchy. But the game today, to me, the single most distinctive characteristic, and yes, analytics is also one, and that might wind up being what it is. But it's hard to see the analytics era ever ending, right? When does that go away? Whereas I can imagine a time when, because baseball wants this to change, when we don't have 10 pitchers on every team that throw 100 miles an hour all throughout the game, or where we don't have starting pitchers expected to go 4 or 5 innings instead of 7. Baseball wants to go in that direction. Whether they'll figure out a way to get there, I have no idea. That is the goal. And so we might, what do they call those guys who start the games? Openers. This might be called the opener era.
Yeah.
There's one.
Yeah, that's a possibility. Taking that whole concept, the analytics era, and we're looking at it. You and I both, like, we love to use numbers to understand the game, but we also understand there's downsides. You can't just lean all of your evaluation by looking at WAR and saying that's all there is.
Right.
This person's good. This person sucks and is the worst human ever because they only have a 46.2 WAR.
Right.
You can't do that. But there is something to be said about the reliance, and I can't watch NBA. It's terrible to me to watch it. I'm like, why doesn't anybody go get a rebound? I know the numbers say not to worry about that stuff and to just keep chucking up threes, and the rules don't allow for a lot of defense. But I don't, baseball has definitely gone in a direction that I don't recognize. I know some of my people that I talk with on X about the Dodgers, they'll complain that it's just an entire roster of aces, that there are 6 aces on this team.
Right.
I don't know that there's one ace on that team. Not how I would count. An ace to me is someone.
They're
opener
era.
Yeah.
Right.
Opener era aces. Yeah. As opposed to, I'm going to pitch 32 to 35 times. You can always count on me. You'll always be in the game. I'm going to go 6 to 9 innings reliably, and 6 I'm going to be ashamed of.
Right.
And I'm going to be a Cy Young contender. That sounds like that. I'm going to pitch 180 innings. Those 6 or 7 pitchers on the Dodgers, my over-under for them is below 800 innings. And look, they've got tons of talent, so they're going to be fine.
Right.
But it is not necessarily enjoyable for fans to see all of these guys just churn through a roster. And you and I've talked about, like, I don't want to see a bunch of guys destroying their arms. Like, whatever Dustin May is capable of doing, it's not staying on the field for very long. And so, God bless, go out and pitch and go earn money. And I hope you get 10 years so you get the full retirement. But it's harder and harder for me to watch guys go out and you hear them with the telltale sign like, oh, his right finger is sore. And I'm like, oh no, this guy's just blown his, So I don't know. I struggle with that. And I don't blame fans that are like, why did you trade this person? Well, he still had value, but not for us. We wanted to pre-build our rebuild. And all of these things that happen, it's not gentle on fans.
I don't disagree with anything that you're saying, except that the Dodgers sell out a lot of their games, and most fans don't seem to mind, which, by the way, is kind of interesting to me because baseball seems truly committed to change, even though the attendance has been good overall and revenues have been way up. Now that might change, obviously, with all the TV stuff that's happening and the reshaping of the regional sport networks to the degree they even still exist. But MLB's marketing is telling them, I think, that fans want to see guys pitching more innings and throwing no hitters and the like. Um, Even if the fans are still showing up at the ballparks, which for the most part they are, and if they're still watching on TV, which for the most part they are, ratings tend to be pretty good for local games. Um, you know, I guess they must have some marketing that's telling them it could be even better if we did this, if we had more guys throwing more innings, more aces. So, and I agree that that would be better. I would enjoy it more. You would enjoy it more.
For sure.
And I guess their marketing or their polling is telling them the same thing. And so I sort of admire them for being public about this, because they could just say, "Hey, why should we change anything? Look at Dodger Stadium last night. There were 45,000 people there. What are we doing wrong?"
Right.
So I think that to some degree, baseball is still run by, for lack of a better word, purists who do sort of miss the old days a little bit, which makes sense because they're all old men for the most part, right?
Sure.
And a lot of the team owners, for example, grew up in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and they want to see the baseball they grew up with, just like I sort of do. Not completely, but sort of.
Yeah.
I want to see Dwight Gooden again, a guy like that, out there for 9 innings. Now, granted, he did hurt his shoulder, but as did Fernando Valenzuela, and as did Brett Saberhagen, as did Kevin Apier, and so many other guys. So that's the rub, right? We want to see the pitchers pitching not only 9 innings today, but also every few starts for the next 10 years, and that's a really tricky combination.
Yeah, and I was trying to think of a good carrot you could build into the system, to encourage, a starter to have something. And it's almost has to be financial, and maybe there's a pool of money or something that goes in, and then the teams that do more of that, or have healthier staffs or whatever. And I don't like to use the stick because that's just too easy. You can always find a good stick to hit somebody with. I don't know that it fixes the problem. But yeah, I mean, look, I think about the drama. Like when we talk about Dave Stieb, it's partly because he had that stretch of time when he would get to 8 2/3 and not get there. Otherwise, we wouldn't talk about Dave Stieb at all.
Right.
Like if he was a guy that left in the 6th inning, there'd be no conversation about Dave Stieb. And so Tim Lincecum on his last chance at ever being great and throwing that last no-hitter and going 140 fuck all pitch. I don't care. I'm going for it. Man, I'm into that. And I think a lot of people are.
No, the lack of the unwillingness to allow pitchers to throw 9 innings or 120 pitches or whatever it is, it robs us of great stories as fans, and it doesn't add great stories somewhere else. It's one thing if you lose these stories, but you gain these. But we gain nothing from 80 pitchers, right?
Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
We get more strikeouts, but strikeouts in isolation aren't anything. Strikeouts are only fun if it's a guy who strikes out 20 in a game, or a closer who comes in and strikes out the side. Those are fun, right?
Yeah.
Goose Gossage, et cetera, et cetera. But a guy who comes in, a reliever who comes in the 6th inning and strikes out 2 out of the 3 guys he faces, who cares? That adds nothing for anybody.
Right.
Story-wise, drama-wise, none of it. So that's why it's fine to lose something. That's inevitable. But when you lose something, you want to also gain something. We haven't gained anything.
Yeah. These the players that defy the numbers, like Luis Ariz, Steve Kwan, these guys who are like, I'm just going to make contact. It befuddles things like WAR and fans that really focus on those things. But I love it. I love watching. Like you basically just have to throw Luis strikes because there's no point in throwing. You're just going to waste pitches because he sees a lot of pitches over the course of a season because he doesn't strike out, and so it's just extra pitches. So like the difference between him and Kyle Schwarber is he's not seeing all those strike 3 balls that Schwarber sees, and so these guys both see a lot of pitches, but through completely different means. I love that. I love seeing him be the antithesis of the nerd back in the stats room that's saying, hey, the more guys you strike out, the less the balls in play, the less balls in play, the less balls that are hits. I love Ariz and those guys that do that. Is it something, I think we've probably talked about this in the past, is that a skill that that could be developed, or are there just a couple of those freaks every now and then that have such great hand-eye coordination that they last long enough to have a good career?
I don't know. I tend to think that they're freaks, that to be successful with that skill set, you have to do so many things really well,
Right.
that you're rarely going to find the correct combination. Nick Madrigal, you remember him? They called him Nicky Two Strike in college because it didn't matter if he had two strikes. He was still going to make contact and hit it pretty hard someplace. He's really struggled in the major leagues because he hasn't made enough contact, or doesn't hit the ball hard enough when he does make contact. Doesn't mean he still can't have a good career, but it seems unlikely at this point. He was another one of those guys, but didn't have the whole combination. Could you train guys to do that? Maybe, but it's not happening now. You're right. I'm sort of flashing back to our conversation. They're just not training for that, really. And you almost have to have a player who just says to himself, hey, this is who I am. This is who I'm going to be. And you need to work with how I am, as opposed to teaching me to have greater exit velocity or take more pit, whatever it is. So I don't know. What I think is better for the health of the game is to create an environment where more types of players can thrive. For example, they did that with the new stolen base rules, right?
Yeah.
That's another change we haven't talked about, but
yeah.
I mean, God, what a massive change. Limiting the number of times a pitcher can throw to first base, which was first, I think, suggested in a book by Bill James back in the mid-'80s. Almost 40 years later, they did it. 40 years.
Wow.
It seemed crazy when I remember reading that essay by Bill in one of his early baseball abstracts. It would have been 83 or 84. No, 84, 85 probably. Those were the first two that I had. And I remember reading that. I remember reading that myself. And his idea was not to get more stolen bases in the game. It was to limit the amount of throws, which was time wasting. Because at that point, you had pitchers, I think famously, I think Chris Welsh, who's now a Reds broadcaster, I've talked to him a bunch of times. I think one time he threw over to first base when Coleman was on first 16 or 17 times. And then the last time he either picked him off or Coleman stole second base anyway. I can't remember which. But Chris Welsh tells the story really well. But Bill was like, this is a waste of our time as fans. We shouldn't have to watch a pitcher throw over there 12 times. Because at that point, as you probably remember, Coleman and Tim Raines and Ricky Henderson, those three in particular, were driving pitchers crazy. They were almost impossible to stop. And it seemed unfair to some degree. So pitchers would just throw over and over and over, because it turned out the more times you threw over, the better the chance you had of him not stealing, either just not going or tiring himself out or getting thrown out of second.
Yeah.
So I read what Bill wrote. I thought, that's nuts. That changes the game too much to limit the number of times the pitcher can throw to first base.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever changed my mind about that, really. But then 40 years later, MLB does it. And it's probably a good thing. Stolen bases are not out of control. It just moves the needle a little bit. It allows a few players to have a slightly better chance of being valuable enough where they can play. And it also expands the pool of skills that can thrive in the majors, which I think is a good thing. It makes the game a little more diverse skills-wise, which I think it's a more interesting game and better for the fans. So, and there are a lot of things like that you could do. And there are some things you could do to help contact hitters. Actually, limiting the shifts probably help them a little bit, not much. That mostly hurt the pull hitters, not the contact hitters. But there are little things you can do here and there, and baseball should think about doing them.
Yeah, there's a lot in there with the conversation. Yeah, I loved, as a kid growing up, watching Vince Coleman, and I'm positive we've talked about this, but the excitement of seeing, oh my gosh, Vince Coleman has 2 feet on the turf. He's totally out of the sliding box. This is his big league.
They would do the split screen all the time. Remember the split screen?
Yeah. Oh, it was so exciting.
In the national games, they would always have the split screen for Coleman. And you could,
it
was really a fun way to watch it. was one of the few things I thought was better about watching baseball on TV than being in the ballpark in that era, was that getting to see that split screen in real time. It was really fun.
Yeah. I would love
Willie
to see
Wilson
some
was
kind
another
of,
guy like that.
oh my
My guy was
gosh.
Willie
Yeah.
Wilson, who was unstoppable
Yeah.
for a few years.
Willie Wilson was great. He was so great that when he was on Battle of the Stars or whatever, it wasn't called the Network Stars because it was baseball. But it was, yeah, Battle of Superstars. And he was the first guy. It's like, I don't need that stupid rope for your 12-foot wall.
Yeah,
and just straight up it.
Yep. I was a big
But
fan
that's
of that
like,
show.
but that kind of stuff that they don't do anymore,
Mhm.
it really, like, it made it when you were a kid, it made it special. Like, I have to stay in and watch this show.
Right.
It's on ABC or whatever it's going to be, because Willie Wilson's going to be on there. And I'm going to see George Brett in the sand pit doing tug of war,
Yep.
and oh my God, it's just, I remember all of it. And those are things that, look, there's other ways to do it. Got social media and that kind of thing. But I don't know. It was such a great thing. And I would love to see some kind of augmented reality aspect, and look, customize it. You don't want all that stuff on your screen, great, just turn it off, but give me the ability to see what that full lead looks like.
I think that's coming if it isn't already here. I don't get too sophisticated with my baseball viewing. I'm sure I've told you, I mostly listen to games, but I know that they are actively working on creating some pretty cool. I mean, it's going to be, if it isn't already, again, I'm probably behind the times, but if it isn't already available, they're going to have VR where you can plop yourself down in the middle of the field and look at.
Oh yeah, that's probably coming.
Right?
Yeah.
And
sit whatever seat you
want. Ever adapt.
Right.
That stuff. Adopt.
Yeah. No, I agree.
I'm a late adopter. I'm a never adopter.
I'm never. Well, there's a lot of good things that are already involved in baseball, and really for me, as I've matured away from the game on the field, and I'm much more interested in all of the competition off the field. And this is where I think, again, like, there's a separation between fanatics and people that love baseball. And so I look at all of the moves that go on and everything, and how teams adjust their rosters. And I look at what the Dodgers do. When everybody complains about them spending a lot of money, yes, this season they've spent a lot of money. Last season they spent a lot of money, but they've been spending a lot of money off the field for years.
Right.
And they are trouncing teams. Right. In all of, like, the fact that Billy Gasparino hasn't been pulled away by some team to run their whole organization is amazing to me. And the Dodgers can put this well of people together and they want to stay. Says a lot about how they're running their team. And so when you talk about packing the park, man, packing the front office with incredible talent, and they just don't skip a beat. They don't miss a single opportunity. They'll bring a guy up and bring him on the roster for one day to have him do one thing. It's all by design. It's amazing to watch them run their organization.
Yeah, a few years ago, baseball had to implement a new rule to prevent the Dodgers from shuttling relief pitchers up and down every single day. Remember that? But you're absolutely right about their front office. And they were the first to, I think, really internalize what was, I always thought was pretty obvious. And then it was quantified by, I believe it was Russell Carlton, who's done a million great studies over the years. And if it wasn't Russell, I apologize to whoever did it. But someone, I want to say it was 5-6 years ago, did a study, really got into the nitty gritty, and said, look, the best way to spend your money is not on the 25th man on your roster. Right. It's to invest in one more person for your front office staff, except that it's not one, it's 20, right? For the 25th guy on your roster, it's now 26. You could hire 20 analysts, and all they have to do is each be worth 0.12 WAR per season, which is not a difficult thing to do, and you've more than made up for them. So, as I think I've said many times over the years, you can it's almost always a good investment to hire people for your front office staff, analytics. Yeah. Where it gets tricky is that you can't just hire them and then send them off to do whatever they're doing. You have to manage the flow of information that they then generate. And I've been away from the Major League Baseball front office environment for long enough that I don't really know who does those jobs. But if you talk to somebody who worked for the Dodgers, they would say, yeah, we have these 3 or 4 people, and they're the ones who are sort of the filters to make sure that all the great stuff that these guys are doing gets up here, right? That's the hardest part. And I think that's why
Yeah.
some teams have shied away from hiring a lot more staff over the years, is they just can't get their brains around how do we manage all that information? Who's going to do that job? Because it's not easy.
Yeah. What, and I follow the Dodgers most closely, but I look around and I see guys go to their team, they rehab, recover, repair, rediscover all these things. I mean, they bring dudes to their team and they instantly jump up and become better, and then they leave and then they regress.
Right.
And some of that's just automatic, but they reliably find these guys. And then when they take a swing at somebody doesn't work out, it's fine. They don't mind that. Like, yeah, we'll draft you with your broken elbow because we're going to let you sit down and get healthy. We're going to put you through our program, which apparently is world-class because they get guys through those things all the time.
Right.
But I don't see other teams doing that. And when you look at the performance that they get from these guys, and when Clayton Kershaw, who's Clayton Kershaw for a reason, when he says, you know what, I don't like the numbers, but I've been convinced over time to listen to what's put in front of me because it works. That's Clayton Kershaw saying that. He's not a Luddite, but he also doesn't want anybody else telling him what to do. And when he's over time gone in that direction, that's remarkable.
Right. No, it absolutely is. When I wrote my book 7 years ago, they were already doing those things, right? And they've only done more since then. The Dodgers, and it all starts at the top. I mean, every single organization creates its own environment, and almost every time that begins at the ownership level. People want to blame the GMs or the head coach or the manager or the director of scouting. I don't care, but it almost always comes down from the very top. And in a lot of organizations still today, I don't know about a lot, certainly some, the primary motivation from the very top is how can we win while spending as little money as possible? Well, you can always find somebody in the accounting part of your organization to say, yeah, that's a good idea, but we can't afford it.
Right.
I know you want to hire that guy, but can you quantify it? Well, not perfectly, but we're pretty sure that if we hire this guy, they'll more than justify his salary. Oh, sorry, that's not good enough because our ownership is telling us that we can't go overboard this year. Well, okay, that's one way to do it, but you're not going to win 90 games very often doing it that way. I think that seems to be the general. I mean, you look at the teams that, frankly, that are at the bottom of the standings year in, year out, they tend to be the ones that have not embraced analytics and every team says we're totally into analytics, right?
Right.
We totally buy in. It's half of what we do. We're big believers in what's the buzzword that I still hear? We meld the objective and the subjective, or the scouting and the statistics, whatever. That's all fine, but let me see your staff list. And if you only have 5 people on your staff, I don't think you can compete with the Dodgers and the Red Sox and the Yankees of the world. I just don't think you can. And when you look at the standings, the answer is usually you're not.
Yeah. Well, and if you go around the league and look at Dodger prospects, whether they were brought into the system or left the system before they fully developed, there's a lot of them. But there are not a lot of other franchise. I don't know that if any other franchise has them matched on that, where they spend time I'll just say the Yankees, they haven't developed a lot of talent reliably, especially not a surplus, where they're like, hey, we're going to trade these guys off to bring in, young lottery tickets and then convert those lottery tickets. Right. Yep. That trade, when they traded away D. Gordon, back when he was D. Gordon, that trade is remarkable how much talent they got back for that. And they routinely win these. So this is another thing where they identify talent at just the level that. So, yeah, okay, they're spending a bunch of money, but you guys are so far behind on what they've done.
If you have those kind of trades are not even really fair when you have the ability to evaluate the talent better than other teams do, and the ability to develop the talent better than other teams do, right?
Right.
If you could just do one or the other, you'd probably have a leg up because you're almost always in the long term going to win the deal if you're trading an established major leaguer who's not a star, which Gordon was. He was a good player, not a star, or young, obviously talented young players who you control for 18 years, if it's 3 of them, right? 18 major league years. But if you have the evaluation piece and the development piece, you're rarely going to lose those.
Yeah. Who do you think is doing a good job who's not the Dodgers, who's built an organization that's fairly resistant to any kind of degradation, for any length of time?
Well, the Braves clearly have been doing a great job for a number of years now. They're probably the only ones that I would put in that group. Other teams, and the Orioles now, over the last 3 years, I mean, what they've done, the improvement over the course of 3 seasons is, I don't know that it's unprecedented. A few other teams have done it, probably including the Astros, who had some of the same front office people that the Orioles have now, also did it. That's really it. Those are the top tier, and certainly the Phillies have done a good job for a number of years now. Dave Dombrowski probably is going to wind up being considered the greatest ever when it comes to combining the analytical side with the subjective side. And I don't know that tale has been fully written yet, but he's been able to make it work with multiple teams. So you have to give him a ton of credit
for sure
for how he's run the Phillies and teams before that. But I mean, at this point, I would say the Dodgers and the Braves have been doing it now for 5 or 6 or whatever number of years it is, better than everybody else has been doing it.
Yeah. And it is for sure that money creates room for error, right. But you can spend the most money in the league, like the Mets have often done, and they haven't won a title since the 1980s, right. So it's not just money.
The Angels had huge payrolls for a number of years. Yep.
Yeah. Or how about those Death Star style Yankees teams? They didn't really win a World Series. They won one in 2009, but that was kind of after that it all happened. And so those mega contracts, Jason Giambi, he never won a World Series. And so we think about those Yankees as being this Death Star, but the reality is Boston beat them during that time, Right.
And other teams. When you invest any huge amounts of money in players past their primes, or just finishing their primes, which they did in a few cases, those are declining markets, has been well established, and teams know that. Everybody knows that now. They understand that. It isn't like it used to be when people would routinely walk around and say, "Yeah, players peak in their early 30s." Nobody says that anymore because the data is so clear that they don't. But teams still do say, "Well, we know he might have peaked already, but he's such a great player. We don't mind overpaying." That's what the Angels said with Albert Pujols.
Right.
That deal was a disaster for them, at least on the field. Because he had one great year, 2 or 3 good ones, and then was basically league average for whatever it was, 6, 7, 8 years. That was not completely predictable, but it wasn't unpredictable either. Teams, I don't think we're going to see many of those. Now the big ones we're seeing are guys who are not even in their prime yet, or who are just entering, blocking them. But you're not going to see any more Albert Pujols deals, I don't think. Or Miguel Cabrera, that deal. Those were horrible deals. I think those are a thing of the past.
And yet, we have Tatis Jr.'s contract, which is not gotten off to a good start.
But he was super young when they signed him to it, right?
He was,
That was a better bet than if he were 30 when they gave it to him. But it is still a risk, no question.
Yeah, Wander Franco, not another one of those ones where you're like, oh man, that went horribly bad, But other ones do work out. I'm curious about Vladdy Guerrero because I know today he seems like this ball mashing monster with a great pedigree in terms of his cohort for age and performance. It's incredible, but I look at it and I go, it's come up and down there. And I look at body type and I think, I just don't know if I would want to spend $500 million on a guy who's going to be first baseman for as long as he can, and then slide over to DH.
Right. I mean, I would lean, if it was my team, I probably wouldn't ever give a player a deal for that many years. Just because you might be able to justify it mathematically or analytically, because if you're going to do that, you have to look at all the players like him before, right? And then what their sort of average, what's the most likely outcome, and you could maybe justify that kind of deal. But I'm also the guy who would probably quit on the 4th round of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Like, I just don't like risk personally. So if I owned a team, I would be like, well, yeah, it's probably going to be fine, but if it's not fine, I'm going to be bummed out for the last 6 years of the contract. So I'd rather not make that commitment.
Right.
But it's not. I don't think it's that difficult to logically justify one of those huge deals for a young player like Guerrero, or Tatis for that matter. With a player like Cabrera or Pujols, it's impossible at this point.
No, right. I mean, you may have to buy some back end lack of production,
right,
and accept that. Yeah, I'm pretty bullish on Soto just because his numbers are so off the chart. And anytime a 25-year-old becomes a free agent and they have that pedigree, I'm not talking about somebody who's a pitcher who comes up who's fringy. If you're 25 and you're a free agent, look out. I mean, you're going to get an incredible 5 years for the most part. Sometimes
more, right, or more. The one thing that again, it comes back to looking at the history of these guys, but if they don't have catastrophic injuries, which is rare for hitters in baseball, they're probably going to have a great decade or so into their early to mid 30s. And they're probably pretty good bets. And people aren't stupid who run teams for the most part. They know that $45 million in the year 2034 is not the same as $40 million, leaving aside regular inflation, which is not that big historically in this country. Salary inflation is huge, right? Because the revenues keep coming in. So unless you think the revenues are going to stop increasing, then you know that salaries are going to inflate by 10+% per season. So $50 million, frankly, is not going to seem like a lot of money in 10 years.
I've been looking with, so I've been hashtag not a statistician, but I understand stats enough to kind of take some cracks at things. And I've been puzzled by WAR's. I think WAR is a bad measure of longevity and durability. We'd have to talk about these things as different topics, but longevity to me is, can you stay on the field in a starting capacity for a number of years? And then and I haven't figured out what the number is for this, but the further you get away from that 27.5-year-old median, like this is the peak, the harder it is to stay in the league, whether you get in early or you stay on the back end. Right. Every year past that, it's harder and harder, which to me, there's potential for more value there that's missed by WAR. But also, WAR, if you miss 60 games, it's like, hey, 4.3 WAR, no big deal. But that potential WAR that you didn't get because you're a person you can't look, no knock on anybody, play hard and get hurt and rest and all that stuff. But when I look at someone like Chase Utley, who not only is short on the longevity side, but also suffers on the durability side, I can't swallow that his WAR number is as accurate as we want it to be, because WAR doesn't account for those things. And I did a little test on this, and I took similar WAR players and I looked at and then I gauged their durability, and it's all over the place. It's a mess. And so you can't reliably say like what WAR is going to predict in terms of durability, but we believe that it does because it tends to stack up. And look, as you get closer to being a fringy player, it just gets more muddy because these guys can't reliably stay on the field very much in the first place because they don't have the skills. So you have to be up at a certain level of cream for this to really work, as far as I'm able to process it. But I don't know. What do you think about my premise that WAR is a bad measure of durability and longevity?
I haven't thought about it enough to have an informed opinion. I think it all, with WAR generally, you touched on this a bit ago, it is a tool, and it is good at measuring some things and not measuring others. That doesn't mean there's something wrong with it any more than there's something wrong with runs batted in or ERA or anything else. Of course there's something wrong. There's something wrong with every single metric that anyone's ever invented. I would say that it's frustrating. It was frustrating to me. It's frustrating to me today to hear people say that WAR is useless or flawed.
Right.
Because, I mean, look, it is flawed. It's also frustrating for me when I see the most valuable player voting results, and it looks like people just went down the list 1 through 10 based on wins above replacement, which I know that most voters don't do exactly, but it's pretty, in my opinion, it's taken on more importance in that process than it should have. Now, I think it's better than it was before.
Yeah.
I think that the results do a better job now of ranking the best players, but I think the best way would be if everybody actually looked at wins above replacement and then said, yes, I understand that he had this, but he contributed in this other way that isn't measured by that, right?
Yeah.
I'd like to see a little more of that. I just don't really trust the results when they track the statistics that much.
Yeah. I also don't like unanimous votes.
Right.
That bothers me. And it seems like unserious, like you've put things on there. I frankly didn't have Ohtani as the MVP last year.
Mm-hmm.
And I know people like just instantly throw up their hands and say, oh my gosh, that's unbelievable. But like you and I both know, his stolen bases weren't all that valuable. Here's another thing about stolen bases. There's academic papers, medical grade, that talk about the more times a major league player hits the ground in a competitive situation, the higher up their risk for injury goes until it hits a point where inevitable happens.
Right.
And so if you have this amazing player doing this, yes, he's going to tear his labrum at some point in the season and not be able to play. It happens in the playoffs in this case, and that doesn't mean you don't steal, but Maury Wills would say, I'm so beat up from stealing bases. Ricky Henderson would say, I'm just so beat up from stealing bases. Don't do that so not only is there that questionable value of the stolen bases, then you go and you look at the circumstances when he stole and what happened, and it's not nothing, but there's like 6 runs worth of value, No,
I agree with all that. I don't. The thing is, I might have voted for Ohtani last year too, so it's hard for me to say that he shouldn't have been unanimous or somebody shouldn't have voted for him. But I would probably trust the process a little more if Soto had gotten more support. Just as, by the way, I would have trusted the process more if Bobby Witt, a shortstop who had a tremendous season, had gotten more support than he did, as opposed to Aaron Judge. It might well be that Judge and Ohtani were the 2 best guys. I'm not saying they weren't. I'm just not sure they were because I'm not sure. I'm not sure how sure all the voters should have been. If that makes sense.
Yeah. When the Dodgers everybody was beat up in July. And this is one of the cases that was used against me. Like it was Ohtani that held him up. I went through game by game. No, it wasn't. He was great. He had his moments. But when you go through game by game, God damn it, there's Teoscar Hernandez.
Right.
And when they were, I forget what the numbers are now, but they were like 11-1 when he drove in 3 runs. And Ohtani wasn't that. He drove in 3 more runs more times. And a lot of times he drove in runs when they were already ahead and ultimately won that game and never lost the lead. So look, I mean, you're picking this.
Drives me crazy, by the way, when people use context to justify an award, but they don't use the context correctly, right?
Yeah.
I completely agree with you. If your measure is he carried the team, okay, if we're talking an MVP, that's a very valid way to think about it, to frame the argument. Right. But then you have to actually show, at least to yourself, that he did carry the team. Don't just make something up, which is what I think probably happens.
And even if you want it to be Ohtani and you say he was very good in July and that's all that matters, okay, great. But you have to also understand what Teoscar did throughout the whole year, and he was vital to them.
Yep.
And what was Mookie Betts doing for, like 4 months out of the season? He was great. He was playing shortstop.
This is another example of something that I think that's a great example of, not that Betts was an MVP candidate, he really wasn't, but if he was better with the bat last year, had a bigger season.
Yeah.
To me, you can't just look at his wins above replacement. You also have to give some value, whatever that is for you personally, to the fact that he was able to play shortstop for a significant part of the season, which relieves pressure on the organization to find someone else who can play shortstop, right?
Yeah.
What is the value there? Well, if you're really super smart, not me, but if you are, you could quantify that somehow. There's not an MVP voter in the world who could quantify the value of being able to make that position switch. But it sure ought to play into your thinking when you're going through that process, right? You can't just look at wins above replacement and not give him. I think, a little extra credit because I made this point a long time ago. I never did anything with it except maybe talk to you about it.
Yeah.
Every organization has a certain amount of what I call organizational capital. That's all your
Right.
staff. That's the brain power of your coaching staff. It's everything. There's a finite amount of a capital that you have that's available to solve problems, make changes, think about trades, all that stuff. Well, the minute Mookie Betts proves to you that he can play shortstop and is willing to do it, you just save some capital in your organization, and that has value. How much, I don't know, but it's got value.
Yeah. And his ability to play short in whatever market is available for shortstops is another piece of value, and this is a real thing. I think you look at Francisco Lindor, who came in second, and he was great, but the Mets were dead in May. They were last place, second to last place. They were doing terrible.
Right.
And then they went on that run. And if you look around him, and so I did a whole thing on using WAR, looking around, and like you look at his peers on the team, and there's just one guy who does a lot of the work. Not that the other players don't exist, but tremendous value considering that the amount of help he has. Compare that to Ohtani, who had a ton of help around him,
right.
because Betts was an MVP grade player until he broke his hand,
right.
And Teoscar was MVP grade. Freddie Freeman's low grade, but he's still MVP grade. All this help around him and this massive pitching staff that's out there, just covering gaps all the time. Well, Lindor didn't have that much help. And so that is a form of value. And I know, like, when we look at this, we don't all agree about that. But there's also one more problem with this whole thing is the Hank Aaron Award exists. Absolutely. Ohtani's Hank Aaron Award winner last year.
Right.
And you can make that one unanimous. But MVP should have a clear gap, an air gap between the two. Occasionally, okay, it can be the same guy.
Right.
But I think you're doing a disservice to those, especially the Hank Aaron Award. If you remember back when Big Papi and Manny were just always like both great. It's like, who's the MVP of that team? I don't know. But they both won Hank Aaron Awards, which is remarkable. But they didn't win MVPs because there was just too much proximity to their greatness. And there's a diminishing effect when you look at somebody else who doesn't have a Big Papi hidden behind him.
It's a really good point. I think that, and I'm not the first to make this observation, but the MVP award to some degree, and not as much now as it used to be because the voters are looking at wins above replacement, but the MVP has historically been a what I call a story award, where if you have the right narrative, you can gain a lot of support. And I think Ohtani got that last year. He gained some support due to the narrative that surrounded him. And I actually don't have, and I actually think that to some degree, it makes sense for it to be a story award. Again, it's one thing I would consider. But I happen to think that if it's going to be a story award, it should be a league story award and not a local story award, if that distinction makes sense. Yeah. Ohtani obviously meant a massive amount. He meant a lot to Dodgers fans and Japanese fans.
Yeah.
I don't know that he was that be considered a real sensation outside of those sort of fan groups in the way that he was in a previous season when he was not only the best hitter, but also the best pitcher. That turned him into a national figure. And, to me, that was a pretty obvious case where, well, of course this guy is the MVP. He's doing this thing that literally nobody's ever done before. And that has multiple sorts of value. Whereas last year he had one value. Two values. He was a massive draw for Japanese fans and Dodgers fans, and he was the best hitter, which that's a lot. Don't get me wrong, but it seemed like that those things caused a lot of voters to ignore some of the other players maybe more than they should have.
Do you have time for one more topic?
Sure.
Spend the next couple of minutes. Okay, good. So the MVP it's always not MVP. The Hall of Fame is always evolving, and they've kind of necked down like what they're going to allow in, and there's quite the backlog now of extra. Outside the Baseball Writers Association voting, there's quite a backlog now of players that need to get in at some point. And I'm saying players, but also careerists like Dusty Baker, is probably, going to be a Hall of Fame guy at some point, Bruce Bochy. But there's several dozen guys that need to get looked at. Hey, Kenny Lofton should probably be in the Hall of Fame. There's a lot of dudes like that. And as these guys get in, you look at the line back and you're like, oh my God, like maybe Steve Garvey never gets in, right? But he's always going to be considered at some point. So you have to kind of clear the glut, but we just keep adding to the glut. So what are your thoughts on, are we being too limiting on this? Like Aramis Ramirez, this sounds crazy when I say this, but he's one of the greatest third basemen of all time. I'm not saying he needs to be Hall of Famer, but he's way closer than people realize. And it could be that at some point we do come back around and those standards change, but he's certainly within the top 15 of all the third basemen ever. So are we being too limiting or no?
I sort of gave up on thinking about the Hall of Fame when Harold Baines was elected. And partly it was because I couldn't wrap my brain around what the Hall of Fame was supposed to be anymore. And that really isn't fair to Baines in a sense, because it had been, for lack of a better word, again, apologies to Harold Baines, bastardized back in the early 70s in particular, when the Veterans Committee voted in so many marginal candidates, and that's putting it kindly. I also stopped thinking about it a lot because it wasn't part of my job anymore, which it was when I worked at ESPN and various other places. Like I had to write about the Hall of Fame, and because I had to write about it, I had to think about it. But I really don't know what the goal is anymore. And this is probably always the case. It probably just took me too long to figure it out. The goal of the Hall of Fame is to satisfy 2 or 3 constituencies. Those being current Hall of Famers, Major League Baseball, and baseball fans. With baseball fans probably, number 3 is probably baseball writers, and then 4 is fans, and the fans are probably a distant 4th. If the fans were what they really cared about, then a lot of fan favorites, Steve Garvey being a great example, Luis Tiant, various others, would have been in a long time ago, right? So, Bill James used to say, I don't know how to talk about the All-Star game unless you tell me who it's for. And the same thing with the Hall of Fame. You have to figure out who it's for. Because the Hall of Fame has changed their voting processes and their election processes many times over the decades, many, many times. Now, why would they change it? Well, they changed it because somebody was pressuring them to change it, right? They don't. The Hall of Fame is a bureaucracy, it's an institution. Those sorts of places don't change because they want to do the right thing. They change because someone is pressuring them to change. So
that's the true definition of bureaucracy too. Like if you get etymological, it's truly what that means.
Of course. Not just bureaucracies, but every large corporation is a bureaucracy in a sense too, which ultimately exists only to perpetuate itself and to please their customers or their constituencies. It's true of the government. It's true of any large company. It's true of Kaiser Permanente. That doesn't mean all these people and these things can't do good work or create good things. But the bottom line is that their fundamental goal is to keep going, right? And what stops you from going is for people to get mad at you enough that they make you stop. So the Hall of Fame has always been responsive to, like the Hall of Fame, when did they put black players or Negro League players in the Hall of Fame? It was early 70s, right?
Yeah.
Was that because someone stood up in a meeting in 1965 and said, hey, this is really important, let's work toward that? No. It was because there was an immense amount of public pressure from the media for the most part, by the way. My friend,
and Ted Williams.
Well, yes, but he was not the first.
Right. But he stood up, he used part of his speech time.
He absolutely did. And he deserves a great deal of credit for that. He was not the first Hall of Famer to say that. I think Bob Feller had done it a few years earlier.
True. Yep.
And my friend Mark Armour has done a lot of work on this, and he's gone back to track the evolution of Feller's opinion, Ted Williams' opinion, which is how he started. He's done a ton of research in the newspaper and magazine world to try to figure this out. And there's this timeline that really started in the 1950s. It took essentially 20 years for it to happen. Hall of Fame could have changed their policy anytime they wanted. They chose not to for 20 years, roughly. So, well, not 20 because nobody was thinking about the Negro Leagues as Negro Leaguers as Hall of Famers in the 50s, but certainly a good decade or so. It was how long that process took, right? Nobody had any doubt about Josh Gibson's greatness in 1960. What the Hall of Fame would say, and what MLB people would say is, well, we would love to put him in, but we can't, right? Our rules don't. It has to be a major league player. Well, no, you can do whatever you want. You're the Hall. No, it's your. It was a conscious choice that was made not to change, and there was public pressure. So, how I got on it anyway, there was public pressure essentially to start allowing people. There was pressure from someone to create a mechanism that would allow a player like Harold Baines to be considered. And once you start considering players like Harold Baines, it is inevitable that some players like Harold Baines will be elected. In Harold Baines' case, fortunately, it was Harold Baines, but he wasn't the first and won't be the last. Right. Should there be more? I don't know. I don't know if the Hall of Fame is a better place with more Harold Baineses. I just have no idea. What I have argued is a better place with people like Frank Jobe, who invented Tommy John surgery, and Bill James, and Jane. I can't think of her name. The one who's been responsible for a lot of the new ballparks, great new ballparks over the years. Right. I was an idiot. She's been on my podcast, but it'll come to me later, unfortunately. But I've made the case in print a few times over the years for a dozen or so people who should be in the Hall of Fame as contributors. Dusty Baker, great example. He'll be elected as manager now because of what happened with the Astros, right? Yeah. But before that, people were like, "Is he really a Hall of Famer? He never won a World Series." Well, yeah, but he also was a great player for 10, 12, 15 years.
Right. And sometimes that difference is tiny between like, what else did Steve Garvey need to do?
Well, I wouldn't vote for Garvey because he never did anything else. He was a really good player for 10 years. That's it. To me, that isn't enough. Garvey doesn't.
No, fair, right? But the distance is not very far. So what's the difference between Chase Utley and Steve Garvey? Right. You know, they both have these times, and then the rest of the time they were
Garvey
was regular. Or
Utley was a better player at his best than Garvey was, in my opinion.
That's probably true. Yeah. Right.
So I would make a distinction. It is not a large gap. I agree with you there.
Yeah.
The players I would make a case for are the Steve Garveys of the world who also did this other thing.
Right.
Or a successful general manager, or a successful manager, or a great scout. There are lots of guys like that out there. You know what I mean? So I wish there was a place for. I wish there was a place for people as pioneers or contributors or whatever it is. You know, frankly, you know what? You know who got in that way and nobody else has in it forever is No, I'm sorry, Buck O'Neill.
Buck
O'Neill has nothing on his resume as a manager or a player, or an executive.
Yeah.
In isolation, that would get him in. Yeah. But when you look at the whole body of work, well, of course he's a Hall of Famer, and that's why ultimately he was elected. Well, that's not why. Yeah. It was the justification. Like, look at what he did over the course of 60 years.
Right.
When he wasn't elected and people got so upset, it was because nobody told the voters you can consider everything. Yeah. What the voters were told, what every voter had always been told, was that you have to elect him as a player or an executive or a manager. Well, O'Neill didn't do any of those things to the degree that has always been expected of a Hall of Famer in those categories. If they had said you can consider him as a contributor, they would have voted him in. They didn't. It wasn't until 15 years later or whatever it was that the voter basically they said, you know what, just get him in.
And after he died.
Yeah, well after. And I blame the Hall of Fame for that, not the voters. I blame the Hall of Fame for not saying, hey, contributor is a perfectly valid category that you can use. They didn't do that.
Right.
They should have.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I'm part of a little bit of a movement to get Felipe Alou in, and there's a whole lot of pioneer.
Oh, there's another great example. He's more than qualified when you consider just as a player manager and whatever else. Absolutely, no question.
Yeah, you're mixing the Trailblazer part, being the first actual Dominican to come off the island and go straight to the majors,
right?
And the work he did, getting just his rubbing Pedro's back and saying you're great, and Pedro believing it, like that right there is those moments only come to certain people, where they take a person and launch them forward.
I'll go back to what Bill James said a long time ago when he was in I think it was his book about I don't know what book it was, or it was even about. But what he said was, that when you're considering someone's qualifications or their value, this has always stuck with me for all these years. Everything counts.
Everything counts.
Everything should count. And not counting something that's valuable, whether it's an MVP discussion or a Hall of Fame discussion, if you're not counting something that you think has value, you're doing it wrong. Yeah. And if you're not going out and looking for those things that have value, then you're limited in your imagination.
Yeah, and some of that value is negative.
Oh, absolutely. No question.
I mean, if you play 150 games once in your career and put together a nice career, like Ohtani will never match Babe Ruth's greatness in terms of career size. He won't ever pitch as much. He won't ever hit as much, but my gosh, in this age right now, who else could even possibly think about approaching that, But when you say these things and you go like, he's on his third elbow, he's on his second shoulder, he's not going to be at his peak for much longer. He's going to be brilliant. I'm excited to watch all of it. You could say all these things and be super stoked, but he's never going to throw more innings than Babe Ruth. He won't, do these things because we can't do all of the things. And he has not been the most resilient player, right? Not a knock. It's just he's doing big things that take a lot out of his body. So we have to accept that. But it's often like you're making the person a bad person by saying they didn't have this capability. That often denotes, like if you're very durable, there's a strong correlation towards the Hall of Fame. You've got to last a certain amount of time. You got to play a certain number of games. But if you get above 2,000 games, the percentage of Hall of Famers, it just goes way up because you were good enough to stay there that long. That's that resistance to the mean when you get out there at age 42, 43 years old. Are you a great player at 43? Most of them aren't. But just existing on the field when there are people who are 27, that's a mark of greatness. So I'll shut up about that. But that's that's kind of the thought process that I use when I count everything. What else is there?
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. Anything else in closing before we go? And thanks for hanging out a couple extra minutes. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's been a blast. I hardly ever get the chance to talk about these things, and as you can tell, I still get a little worked up. It's a sort of a vestige of my previous life. For those who are, if anybody's interested, my current life, for the most part, professionally, is with this outfit, the West Coast League,
right? Which
is a collegiate summer baseball league. Everybody's heard of the Cape Cod League. Well, we are the closest thing to the Cape Cod League in the western half of North America, with 17 teams, and we play from late May through mid-August. And I didn't mention this. I'm the commissioner of this league, so
that's the commissioner.
That's what I do now, basically. But I still have this passion for professional baseball, and especially the history of the game, which I love.
My big plans to come up and see you and go to a game, to go with the commissioner. How fancy is that? Got waylaid because
party deck at the Pickles games.
Yeah, I'm totally down to go up and sit up there. I have my ankle rebuilt. Look at us being twins, and then my ankle rebuilt.
Your ankle rebuilt? I just had my ankle rebuilt.
Yeah, that's why I was mentioning it. And then my ankle rebuild got infected, and that was the
Oh,
time
great!
that I
Thanks
was
for that.
yeah.
Thanks for that.
No,
Encouragement.
you're going to be fine. Don't let him
I
take
got
the
that
stitches
today.
out too early.
Remember this?
Yeah, I do. Oh my gosh, knee scooters are great until the second you get out of it, and you're like, "Fuck that thing! I never want to be on it again." Yeah, no, but yeah. So I'm hoping to come up this year, and everybody should check that out. Look at the ballparks online; they're gorgeous. And this is exciting.
I really believe this. This isn't just me saying this because I'm with the league, but I think that we have, on balance, on average, the most scenic league in the country. Well, North America, because we have 5 teams in Canada. I mean, we have so many mountains and rivers and oceans. We have one ocean, I guess, but I mean, it really is a phenomenal group of cities and ballparks. I mean, I'll give you one example. If you go to a game in Bellingham, Washington, and you look beyond the right field fence in the distance, is literally Hurricane Ridge in Olympic National Park. It's right there. And there are all sorts of other amazing things you can see in our ballparks or just next to them. So it really is a tremendous, for baseball fans. I know a lot of fans do trips, right, during the season. And they go to a map and they go, oh, where are the minor league stadiums? A tip for you, especially if you're in the Northwest or British Columbia, don't overlook collegiate summer baseball because the experience is going to be basically the same, and you're going to have some incredible options for scenery and other experiences, wineries if you're into that, and fishing, whatever it is. We have it all.
Yeah. I'm excited to get up there this year for sure. The West Coast League is exciting. And if you feel like the Major League Baseball guys, it's a big money grab, get out to these smaller venues. Go see indie ball. Go see all these unaffiliated things.
Economical. It really is. I mean, I would personally rather go to a game at this level, my level, than I would a Major League game, just because, frankly, it's way cheaper and it's way easier to park and all those good things. Not that I don't enjoy Major League games, because I'll go to 4, 5, or 6 this season, most likely. But at my age and having been to basically all the Major League stadiums, not quite all, but almost all of them, I have more just pure fun going to a West Coast League game or a Northwest League game than I do at a Major League game.
All right. Well, there it is, everybody. Go check out those games this summer. It's going to be wonderful. Let me wrap this thing up and be right back to you, Rob. Everybody else, I'll see you all twice tomorrow. Here we go.